Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malday, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, I'm excited to welcome three immigration reporters to tell us all about what it's like to cover immigration at a time of rising migration, increased humanitarian challenges, and a polarized political climate. BBC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal will be interviewing Camilo Montoya-Galvez of CBS News, The Washington Post's Maria Sacchetti, and Uriel Garcia, who works at the Texas Tribune. The reporters will take us through their experiences covering national and local immigration developments over the past year, both on the ground and from a distance. Stay tuned to hear all about the policy, politics, and humanity of covering immigration in the United States.
This Week in Immigration prides itself on being a place to break down the complexities of the immigration debate for our audience. Our guests this week also share that mission, but also have the responsibility to convey the humanity inherent in immigration as journalists. I am pleased to welcome to This Week in Immigration three fantastic immigration reporters. First, we have Camilo Montoya-Galvez, who is the immigration reporter at CBS News, where he covers the key debates in immigration policy as well as the human stories of those affected by our complex system. Camilo was born in Cali, Colombia, but was raised in the suburbs of New Jersey. And if you ask him, he says he's a proud New Jersey guy. Camilo previously worked at Telemundo's television station in New York, where he won 3 New York Emmy Awards. So welcome to the podcast, Camilo.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Next, we have Maria Sacchetti. Maria covers immigration for the Washington Post with a focus on immigrant communities and immigration and customs enforcement. She previously reported for the Boston Globe, where she was a member of the team that shared in the Pulitzer Prize for reporting on the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings. She has covered several humanitarian crises across the world and received an award for her coverage of immigrants missing along the southern U.S. border. So welcome to the podcast, Maria.
Thanks for having me.
And last but not least is Uriel Garcia, an immigration reporter at the Texas Tribune. Based in El Paso, Uriel covers all things immigration as they relate to Texas. Before joining the Tribune in 2021, he worked at the Arizona Republic, where he covered police violence and immigration enforcement. Originally from Mexico and a native Spanish speaker, unlike me, Uriel grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. So welcome to the podcast, Uriel. So Camilo and Maria, I'm going to start with you both, since you work for national press outlets. And yes, for those of us who live in Washington, D.C., the Post is our local paper and a national press outlet. You have a very broad remit in covering immigration policy and human stories. So what stories have stood out to you this year from that sort of national scope?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Theresa, because I feel that border policy especially has changed quite dramatically in the past few years, given the situation with the very high numbers of migrants who are turning themselves in or crossing the border without permission. And I think that's reflected in the current talks in Congress to potentially make the first major overhaul in immigration law in decades. And I would say that that's currently the biggest story right now on this front nationally. We have a group of bipartisan senators and the administration, from what I understand, making some significant agreements on changing asylum law, increasing deportations for certain migrants, and as well as increasing the detention of people pending the adjudication of their claims. And, a lot of these policies that the administration is now open to, I'm told, would be, from my perception and perspective, unthinkable just 3 years ago when the administration came into office, Theresa, and everyone here knows this too, promising to overturn many of the Trump administration policies that President Biden called cruel, inhumane, and draconian. And in many ways, his administration now finds itself in a moment where it is entertaining similar policies, I think, because of the way that the politics of this issue have changed, the operational reality on the ground, not just along the border, but in cities like New York, Denver, Chicago, struggling to receive migrants, and also just the public perception on this issue. We have conducted polling here at CBS News. Other outlets have done similar polling that indicates that many Americans view the president's immigration policies negatively. And I think this is in many ways a perfect storm. So I'm sorry to highlight a very recent national story, but that to me is really the key story this year, because if these talks actually come to fruition, Theresa, as you know, that would be a huge change to the system in a manner that we have not seen since the 1990s.
Maria, what about you? What would you say is the biggest national immigration story of this past year?
Well, I mean, so I have a bit of a list actually, and even though I am a national reporter, I wanted to say that I believe deeply in local reporting, and I think on the ground is my favorite place to be. So and in the neighborhood. So as much as I love DC, I think local reporters are and regional reporters are incredibly important. That said, for me, I think the year just started off right away with Biden's shift to the center. I mean, he was elected on the most progressive immigration platform I have ever seen. And as soon as the numbers started to shoot up, I mean, he balked. I mean, even he even said, we want a humane immigration system, but we don't want 2 million people on the border. And he's had way more than that. So the other thing that has struck me as an incredible change is the sheer number of children showing up, children and teenagers. That has been incredible. I mean, we talked so much about that in 2019, 2018, but the numbers in the past few years have just blown those numbers out of the water. So that has been something huge. The other thing are the child labor violations. I mean, the Times, to their credit, they have another incredible story. Reuters has done great work on that. We went to Nebraska earlier this year. We found that people were prosecuting parents for letting their children work, even though in their home countries that was common. That is huge. And what's going to happen in the future is those kids are going to grow up and be undocumented adults if nothing is resolved. The other thing I think has been really interesting, sorry to have this long list, but it was a great question because there are differences. I mean, in many ways, immigration reporters have been covering the same stories for 100 and so years, really. If you go back and look at National Archives, you can find these same kinds of stories. But these have been different. The creation of legal pathways for specific groups, that's in court. And I think the state activism, under Trump and under Obama, especially under Obama, I think, because people sometimes forget that, there was a lot of resistance to immigration enforcement. And that got a lot more attention under Trump, but there was a lot under Obama too, because he deported more people. And so, and we're seeing that kind of more state activism, with people actually like in Texas and Florida and Arizona, like putting people on buses or planes and sending them to states that don't always get that. And you're seeing states like New York and cities such as Denver and Chicago kind of having to deal with that. So all of that, I feel like this year really, past couple of years, but this year in particular has really been distinguished in that way.
Yeah, I mean, in DC, we think of immigration as a federal issue, but obviously it has a lot of state implications. As you mentioned, states being more active vis-a-vis the federal immigration policies, which brings us perfectly to Uriel on the ground in Texas. You have a more targeted focus in your reporting looking at Texas, and obviously Texas has had an outsized impact on the national immigration conversation for many years now. But what stories have stood out for you this year?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple stories that have stood out to me, particularly the one that I have in mind is the concertina wire that Texas has deployed in Eagle Pass, and just some of the injuries that this wire has caused to migrants crossing the Rio Grande. And I think that story, there's a lot of angles to it because it shows the conflict between state troopers and border patrol agents. We're talking about a federal agency and a state agency, and how when state tries to enforce immigration, it creates conflict about between these agencies. Also, the human suffrage, as I mentioned, right? Just migrants getting injured, having to swim through the Rio Grande. And when I was down there, one of the things that I saw was a Venezuelan man who was walking on crutches through the river. And I asked him why he was doing that, why he was alone, and he basically said that because Venezuela is lacking a lot of medical resources, he thought he needed to flee and come to a country where he thought he could be taken care of, or at least seek medical resources that he needed. He had a broken leg. He had scars all over his left side of his body. Apparently, he had been hit by a motorcycle a year prior. And so seeing that and the fact that DPS was just on the riverbanks and not doing anything about someone in need really stood out to me, that contrast. Additionally, another story that stood out to me was early in 2023, I'd been invited by a group of anthropology students from the Texas State University. They were exhuming 26 bodies of unidentified migrants who were buried in also an Eagle Pass in a county cemetery. And the smell, seeing a decomposed body really stood out to me. But I think that's something that we talk about, advocates talk about, we write about as journalists. But I think seeing it for the first time for me really stood out to me, because this is exactly what advocates have been warning about, that when you force people to cross illegally, and a lot of them end up dying. And for me to finally see that in real life, like I said, it stood out to me a lot. The smell, the sulfur smell of a decomposed body just stayed with me, not just mentally but literally on my body. I could not get rid of the smell from my clothes. So those were two stories that stood out to me.
Yeah. And just for our listeners who may not know, DPS is the Texas Department of Public Safety. That's sort of the state level law enforcement body that had deployed its law enforcement officers to the border. So, Uriel, you mentioned some of this, but I'd like to ask both Maria and Camilo, what are the particular stories or types of stories that you think are most important to cover when we look at immigration? And how do you and your editors, I assume you work closely with the editors, decide what stories to focus on and to cover? And I don't know who wants to go. Maybe I'll start with Uriel this time. We'll go back around.
Yeah, for me, I mean, Maria and Camilo's jobs, right? They're busy a lot because there's so many changes, and I try to follow up with them and other reporters who cover immigration on a federal level a lot. And it's hard to decide what stories we're going to pursue, because being on the ground and not necessarily having access to some of the sources they may have, we try to humanize some of the stories that they're covering on a national level, and maybe provide that public service, that instead of beating ourselves up for not having access to some of the sources they have, let's provide readers to what we do have. And it's something that doesn't get covered in law, talking to the migrants themselves, asking them why they're here, why they're coming, what their experience was, and for those who and try to counter the narrative that the border is falling apart. It is simply not. Are people overwhelmed? Yes. And I think the people are overwhelmed are the migrants themselves and the people who work with migrants directly. But the city itself is not falling apart. I can go out any day and have dinner with my wife. I can go hiking, which is a pretty common thing here. Nothing falls apart. And I think that's the service that we provide, to be able to counter that narrative that the border is falling apart because thousands of migrants are coming.
Yeah. Camilo, you want to go next?
Sure. And by the way, I just want to say that I strongly believe that local reporting, like the one that Uriel does on a daily basis, is critically important, not just for Americans and everyone across the globe, but for us who are covering this from a federal perspective. It's so important to just get that on the ground accounting of what's happening, because sometimes what we're told in DC is actually not being implemented on the ground, or it's not happening on the ground as we are being told. And you guys are the ones who are making sure that we're holding these people accountable in DC, right? The elected officials and the policymakers. So I really appreciate your work and the work of other local reporters. It's critically important. In terms of important stories that I think we should be prioritizing, I always tell my editors that there's always this kind of conflict that is pretty evident in a lot of immigration stories, in which the reporter tries to convey what is important and new and why readers should care about this. And at the same time, they often have to take the time to explain how the system works. And maybe they just did that 2 days ago in a separate story about something completely different, right? And so I personally enjoy stories that capture the moment, capture the news of the day, the importance of what is being conveyed, but that in some ways include some explanation. It could be a simple explanation of how the system is working, or how it is supposed to work, at least, right? Because I find that really valuable, because I get a lot of questions, not just from viewers and readers about how different laws and policies work, but also from my team here at CBS, right? Who, they don't follow this as closely as I do. And so I find it really valuable to explain how the system works, even if the story itself is not an explainer like story, right? So, for example, I was in the remote Tucson sector in Arizona last week, covering the arrival of migrants from Africa, Asia, and other parts of the globe who are waiting outdoors to be processed by agents who are oversaturated and overwhelmed because of the number of people crossing, right? And a lot of these folks were sleeping there overnight, braving the elements. It gets really cold. It's a desert, but it gets really cold at night. And it's a very human story. It's a story about the folks having to, relieve themselves in the outdoors, about having to sleep on the ground next to the border wall, about families in Mexico coming to the border wall and selling them food and coffee because they're staying there for so long and they're taking advantage of the situation to, make some profit. But it's also a story about policy, right? Because these folks are not being screened, right, for asylum at the border. They're waiting to be processed, but the Border Patrol process and review is focused on whether or not they could be a danger to society, or they could be potential national security threats. And by and large, they're being released. And most people don't understand that they're not being screened for asylum at the border, that instead they're being released with cases that are going to take years to complete, right? And so I think once people understand that fact, I think they can get a better understanding of the problems with the system, right? Because I think there is some consensus that the status quo is not good for anyone, right? It's not good for people who have legitimate cases, because they're going to be in this limbo for years, right? It's not good for the country, because the country cannot decide in a reasonable time when a migrant qualifies and when a migrant does not qualify for asylum, right? And it's also not good for just local communities that have to operationally and logistically deal with this very, real problem. And so I particularly enjoy those types of stories that tell the news of the day, humanize the issue, but also explain how the system works, or how at least it's supposed to work, and why it's so dysfunctional. Because again, people just don't follow this as closely as we do.
Yeah. I mean, now, Camila, you have another disadvantage in that most of your stories are relatively short form. You have maybe 2 minutes on a TV broadcast and short form. Maria, sometimes the Washington Post can have longer stories, and I know you've participated in some of those. What's your answer to this question of what you think is most important and how you decide what to cover?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of breaking news and a lot of court coverage on this beat. That's been for years, and I was hoping that would change a little bit.
Slow down, slow down.
Well, it's just, I just never know. When somebody, I mean, we could all be on this call, and the court ruling we're all waiting for could happen. One of several, but one in particular, and so. So that is a big balancing act, having to kind of track different things. And for me, I don't like to just report on the ruling. I like to read the filings. I like to go deep and be able to really be fluent in what's happening. And I find it helps the readers hopefully understand it better. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. The other thing is, what I really like to do is when I go somewhere, is to try to really spend a lot of time talking to a lot of different people. Like if I go to a particular city, I might go to a city council meeting, I might go to a school board meeting. It's kind of things a lot of reporters dread, but it can tell you a lot about a city's priorities. I'll go to migrant camps. I'll spend time with people, not just a few minutes to get a quote, but hours. And all of that is really important to understanding why people are coming and what they're doing. As far as reporting, I think the most important things is to really challenge everything. Can't tell you how many, one of the issues I've seen in recent years is how polarized the media has gotten and how polarized sources have gotten. It's gotten to the point where people, on the right will only talk to right-wing media, and people on the left will only talk to left-wing media. And I'll call someone up and ask them a question. They're like, "Oh, no one ever asked me that question," and that is troubling because they never have to answer it. And so those are the kinds of conversations, that happened, and then not, before the '86 Act, before in past when people had to talk to each other. So that's the kind of journalism I want to do. So for example, do we know that everybody coming to the border is an asylum seeker? Absolutely not. When was the last time an immigration reporter or when was the first time an immigration reporter was able to go to a court and pull a file? Never, because those files are secret. But when we cover criminal courts, we read the files, or civil courts and the real court system. So a lot of what you see in the media, or examples of what you see, are people, finding people in the system because an advocate pointed them to them. Or they, maybe they'll find them on the ground because they're out at a shelter or something. You're able to talk to them, but it's very difficult to verify their stories. And so that, what we do, what is, our most valuable, I think one of our most valuable contributions is to be able to verify information. So, the law says that if you set foot on US soil, then you can apply for asylum. But why is that the answer? Why is dragging a child through the Darien the answer? I mean, these are, sophisticated governments, sophisticated systems, why is that the way? And yet every time I go to the border, I meet someone who, to my ear, I'm not a lawyer, but really could have an asylum claim. And so, the only way to find out is to ask. And the volume, compared to the resources the United States has set up and the rest of the region, is really, everyone agrees, inadequate. One last thing I will say, that I covered 2015, I went to Europe to cover the crisis, and we watched the boats coming across from Turkey to Greece, and then we followed them all the way up through Germany by land, kind of walking. And what I was so struck by there is the UN presence, the presence of nonprofits. Each crossing, there were huge compounds of medical care, food, organization, information. And that is just not something I ever saw when I was, riding the trucks, from southern Mexico through Veracruz, all the way up to DF and to the Mexico City. And that is a huge question, and I think it's really good to look to other regions to see how different our hemisphere is from others.
Yeah, that brings up another angle to all of this. So, Maria, you mentioned the Darien Gap and Western Hemisphere. There's an international angle to this that I know many of you have visited countries that migrants are leaving, as well as the routes they've traveled before they get to the southern border. You mentioned some of this, Maria, but what other parts of the international aspect of this do you think it's important for your readers to kind of understand?
I think that, just the fact that, the displaced, I mean, population is at a high, right? And so you also have the displacement, you have climate change, you have all these issues that are going on that can sometimes be difficult to cram, into a news story when everything's breaking and there's a lot of policy issues going on. But I think worldwide, millions of people are on the move, and they're on the move from countries that, each of them have different things going on. And I think this is something I think about all the time, and you try to address in news stories, but I think those are the complexities of of the world right now, is that so many different people are on the move, whether it's from Africa going to Europe, or people crossing, people fleeing Iran, Iraq. I mean, it's just it's extraordinary. I mean, there are countries with far more migrants or migrant issues than we have. So I think ours right now is mostly from this hemisphere, from the Western Hemisphere, but it's amazing how quickly migrant flows can change and adjust, and so you really have to constantly be monitoring the numbers and the reasons and the country conditions back home.
Well, Camilo mentioned when he was in Arizona the number of African migrants that are there. San Diego seeing a record number of Chinese migrants. But I'm going to turn to Uriel because, again, you're in El Paso. El Paso is a sister city right across the border in Juarez, in the border region. At the center of a lot of this is a really important bilateral relationship with Mexico. To what extent do you and your colleagues kind of see what's happening in migration as part and parcel or an important part of that bilateral relationship?
Yeah, I mean, something that El Paso leaders will tell you is that, El Paso prides itself in the fact that there's a lot of immigration, and it's how it was founded, right? I mean, when you think about the Mexican Revolution, a lot of refugees from Mexico were fleeing Mexico and coming to El Paso, so it's not new. And what I was mentioning earlier, with the thousands, hundreds or thousands of migrants coming and being released into El Paso, I think it also shows sort of how strong the infrastructure is for in El Paso. The fact that you release migrants and the city is still running, and so that's something it prides itself in the fact that El Paso is used to this, or at least it should be, right? Even though there seems to be a cycle and there seems to be selective memory about immigration, is that every few years there's migrants sleeping in the streets and the hysteria starts, right? And national media comes, and right wing groups use that national media clips to advance their own talking points. But the point being is that, yes, I mean, it's part of El Paso life. Migrants coming through here, and it's part of the economy. We can't stop it, and I think one talking point that we hear a lot is close the border. I don't think people realize what closing the border means. Is Are we talking about not letting migrants in, not letting asylum seekers in, or are we talking about literally closing all the border because we're going to lose billions in trade? And I think that's something that people don't realize, is that migrants are not the most common crossing the El Paso, from Juarez into El Paso, or El Paso to Juarez. It is average people going to work, waking up in the morning in Juarez and going to work in El Paso, or vice versa, waking up in El Paso and going to dinner in Juarez. And it is very common for people to cross the border back and forth, for whatever reason, right? Not related to immigration. And so I think for both El Paso and Juarez, it is very necessary for both cities to thrive, for that migration to continue. Tourist migration, or just tourism in general, is just needed. And so if we were to close the border, we'd be cutting the oxygen from both cities that depend on each other.
Camilo, you've had the chance to travel in the hemisphere a lot and see migrants on the path. And how do you look at sort of the international aspects and how do you try to incorporate that in your coverage?
Well, I would say two things. I think most Americans are not fully aware about the daily humanitarian situation in Mexico, especially in northern cities in Mexico, as well as, in the south in Tapachula. You have a fixed migrant population in most of those places, either staying at the shelters for a temporary amount of time, or in many cases living on the streets, or they've been able to manage to get an apartment or even a house. And a lot of these folks don't intend to stay there. They're either working to get enough money to pay a smuggler to come into the US. Right now, a lot of them are waiting for an appointment to enter the US through the CBP One app. When we did a story with 60 Minutes in the spring, we went to Ciudad Juarez. And as soon as we started asking people in the main town square in Juarez whether they were waiting for an appointment, dozens and dozens of people came up to us to say, yes, we're in a similar situation. They were showing us their phones and the error messages that they were getting. And we were asking maybe a handful of people initially, but over 15 minutes, the crowd grew to maybe even 200 people in the main town square, just waiting to talk to us to explain the frustration of not being able to get an appointment. And so I don't think most Americans understand that northern Mexico is a huge staging ground for migrants, and that there are very real and dire humanitarian complications and factors in northern Mexico that affect the US. Mexico is not just Mexico City or Los Cabos or other Acapulco and other, tourist destinations. It really is a major transit route for the migrants who are coming to the US. And they're dealing with humanitarian implications of their own too, just like we are here in the US. And so I think that's an important thing that we should not lose sight of, that this is not an American problem. It is a global challenge. And what I saw in Arizona last week just illustrates that. I met people from all over Africa: Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, Senegal, Morocco. I met people from different countries in Asia, Syria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, India, and also your more traditional sending countries in Latin America, Mexico, the Northern Triangle countries, many Ecuadorians. And these are very striking demographic shifts because, as we all know, for many years it was mainly Mexicans and Central Americans coming to the border. And now we're seeing unprecedented numbers of people from beyond those countries come. Ecuador, for many years, was a relatively safe place with a stable economy. And now, because of the security situation there and the deteriorating economic conditions there, unprecedented numbers of Ecuadorians are coming here. And so I don't think the American public has fully grasped the scale and the global scale of this issue, as well as the humanitarian crisis that's also in Mexico, right?
I just wanted to, if you don't mind, Teresa, I wanted to add
Go ahead.
to
Oh,
what
yeah.
Camilo said because I think he brought up a point that I don't think a lot of, like he said, a lot of Americans realize. And I think when average Americans have this debate about immigration, we tend to see Mexico as our backyard or as an alley, as in like we need to kick migrants out back to Mexico, and not realizing that many of the migrants coming are not Mexican, and we can't depend on Mexico. If the U.S. is a sovereign country who should not be responsible for millions of immigrants, then I would ask Americans to ask themselves, why should Mexico then if they're not Mexican, right? So, and I think that we don't talk about enough solutions. And rather than we talk about a lot of enforcement, but we don't get creative with solutions. And I think, you know, I think that's something that, like Camilo said, just highlight that point that this is bigger than the U.S. This isn't just a U.S. problem. People are not coming here to just take American jobs. It is a global phenomenon going on right now, and uh, countries need to get together with coming up with solutions and get creative. Because the more enforcement we see, the problem seems to get bigger.
Not smaller, yeah. I'll just say something that I have said. I think I know I've said it to Camilo and Maria when I've spoken to them about this issue. Our politicians seem to think that we can order Mexico to take back migrants. If we restart MPP or we reinstitute Title 42, Mexico will just take anybody back. And they are a sovereign nation. They do not have to do that. And if they say no, that puts us in a very significant problem, if that's our law that says we have to do that. So, and not only does the American public not necessarily realize that, our policymakers don't necessarily get that. So it's something to pay attention to. I wanted to finish out this segment with just asking, you've all sort of talked about this in your own ways. How do you balance conveying the humanitarian issues and the personal stories of immigrants with this? I mean, it's such a political story for the United States, right? And I know that you have counterparts in your organizations that cover politics and probably talk to you all the time about the political side of this. Like, how do you marry those two things? How do you try to balance the perspectives among all these different viewpoints when you're doing your work? Camilo, do you want to start there?
Sure. So this is a question that I actually get asked a lot because here at CBS News, we have a very diverse audience with very diverse sets of views on many issues, including something as polarizing and contentious as immigration. And so my responsibility is to be nuanced, fair, and nonpartisan. That's very important to me, to make sure that we are able to convey information that drives the conversation on this issue nationally, but in a way that is fair, nuanced, and again, nonpartisan, and that people with very different views on this issue can trust. And that's very difficult because, again, as Maria mentioned, the country is obviously very divided, but so is the media landscape. It's very fractured, right? And so increasingly a lot of people, especially on the fringes, turn to media that are in many ways echo chambers, right? That echo their own political views and that don't really take the same amount of care and time to make sure that everything is factual and nonpartisan. And so we really have to, in my opinion, make sure that we are including the very different voices on this issue, and that we're also making sure that we're using language that can be seen as neutral and nonpartisan. That's very important to me. And I think that can be done without dehumanizing anyone, because that's also very important to me. I think we have to respect the dignity of everyone involved in the system, including the migrants, and that's very important. And I know the two goals seem in conflict with each other, and I'm not going to lie, they sometimes collide, and there is some tension there. But I think it's our job to strike the right balance, right? Because the consequences of not doing so, I think, are bad for everyone. And there are a lot of Americans who are looking for honest, factual reporting on this issue, who have not made up their minds on any of these policies, and who want an honest description of what's going on and what the problems are, right? And so I feel it's our job and responsibility to give them that information so they can make their own decisions, and to factually describe the system, but also the situation that's happening either at the border in New York, in Chicago, in Texas, and so forth. So that's really critical to me, especially.
Yeah. Uriel, most of us in DC, I know we think of Texas as being this red state, but there's diverse viewpoints in Texas too about these issues. How do you balance the political issues around this with the humanitarian issues as you're reporting?
Yeah, I mean, I think Camilo just made a point that I've thought about before, but not been able to articulate, which is sometimes balancing some of these things collide, right? Some of the rhetoric that is being thrown out doesn't necessarily match the reality of on the ground. And so what I try to do is I try to, when I'm highlighting a specific issue, I try to focus on one migrant family and highlighting the nuances of this migrant family, because one of the mistakes that we make as journalists is that we try to generalize as much as we can to capture the big picture. But I think the three of us, the three reporters here, know that every migrant that comes doesn't come for the exact same reasons as the other migrant that may have told you they came for XYZ reasons, right? There is an underlying problem why people are coming, but I think each person has individual reasons why they're at the trying to cross the border. And so I try to highlight those issues. And I think it was Maria who said it, that not everyone here who's coming is seeking asylum, and they may think that they qualify for asylum, but they don't necessarily do. And so I try to get nuanced as nuanced as I can with that person who tells me I'm here for economic reasons. Well, what are the economic reasons? And you start finding out that there is an underlying issue that's causing migration, right? And some of those issue includes obviously issues with public safety, corrupt governments, the effects of climate change that I think doesn't get talked about a lot, right? I'm thinking about a man from Nicaragua who told me that he made a living as a fisher and for decades. And as I come to find out, the fish are disappearing and from where he was living, and so that disrupted his way of life, and that's why he was coming to Miami, hoping that he could find a fishing job in the U.S. Of course, like I said, it was an economic reason, but the underlying issue here was the effects of climate change caused fish to disappear from the sea where he was fishing from. The point being is that I try to get as nuances and as specific as I can, even though that might not reconcile with the rhetoric that's being thrown out. But I think, like Camilo said, people sometimes just want very specific, very factual reporting of why are people coming and why are they doing it illegally.
Mhm. Maria, how do you tackle these possible conflicts?
I mean, those summaries were just both perfect. But I guess what I would add is my goal throughout the ever since I started my first job has always been to be the reporter who shows up, who everybody can call, no matter your background or politics, or just to always try to treat people respectfully and to listen to them and to gain their trust, and that's and to gain the trust of readers. And that's always by telling the truth, even when you risk losing a story. Longtime immigrants will always ask me, if I tell you my story, will this help me? And my answer is always, I don't know. And you have an ethical conversation about, well, if you have a deportation order, this is what could happen, or whatever it is. Just tell the truth about something. And the other side of that is, I'll get pitched stories and they'll say, well, you have to leave this out about them, you have to leave that out about them. And I say, no, I won't do it. My job is to tell the truth, to verify the information, and to provide the most comprehensive report possible to the readers of the Washington Post. So that's what we try to do every day, and every day we have a new chance to do it, and so we're looking for that.
Well, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to try to do a little predictions about what might be coming in 2024 and talk a little bit more with these wonderful reporters. So stay tuned. So as we wrap up our podcast for this week and this year, because this will be the last podcast we release in 2023, I'd like you to put on your crystal balls a little bit. Looking forward into 2024, what developments in immigration do you think will be most interesting? And are there things that you haven't covered yet in this landscape that you would like to cover? Who would like to go first?
I guess I can start. I mean, obviously, I mentioned this earlier, but I think we should obviously monitor the ongoing negotiations in Congress to see if anything actually comes to fruition and if lawmakers are able to agree on a deal. Because if that is the case, as we mentioned, that would be very significant. And if there is a deal and these major changes to asylum and border policy are enacted, it's going to be our jobs to see how they play out on the ground, and whether or not they have the intended effect of lowering the number of people crossing in between ports of entries. So I think that's something that we should definitely keep in mind. A story that I've been wanting to work on for a while is this reliance that many conservative rural communities have on migrant and refugee workers, and how that sometimes is inconsistent with the way that politicians in those areas talk about immigration. And so we have identified, for example, many communities in the Dakotas, in Iowa, in Missouri, in other very red places that rely on migrant labor because of an aging population, because they don't have enough native born workers, and that embrace these people because they're hard workers, right? And because they get the jobs done that they need to fulfill. And so that's something that I've been wanting to work on for a while. It's just not as urgent as the other issues we're covering, but it is
got to keep up with the breaking news.
It is a critical aspect of this conversation, I think.
Yeah, Maria, what do you see in 2024 as sort of looking ahead? What you think are going to be some of the big stories, and what haven't you been able to cover that you want to?
Sorry, Camilo, you're very generous. I'm not going to share my story ideas, but I will say that, I will say that I think we're all tracking, the lawsuits that could upend the policies, the very fragile system they have in place right now. And now
you're speaking specifically about the lawsuits against the parole programs,
right? Pardon me, about parole. Okay. I'm interested to see where DACA goes, and there's other lawsuits, that deal with asylum issues that we're tracking, and the family separation lawsuits, the tort lawsuits, and the administrative claims. Those are also out there. So and still for the most part unresolved. So all of that
we try to cover a lot of those lawsuits on the podcast. We even have a special segment we call the gavel whenever something comes down. So we will follow you on that, Maria. Uriel, coming back to you in Texas, what are you looking for?
So we haven't talked about this, but I think it's pretty consequential, as I'm sure you guys know. the Texas legislature passed an immigration law that would basically make crossing the border a state crime. Um, and so it would require for it would empower police officers to arrest migrants who cross in between a port of entry, arrest them and charge them. Like I said, it would create a state crime for illegal entry or illegal re-entry, and a judge would be required to sign an order to have a police department return the migrant back to a port of entry, so the migrant would return back to Mexico. In other words, to make it simple, it would make police officers immigration agents, and it would include the criminal justice system in this system. The governor has already said he's going to sign it. Once he signs it, it will go into effect in early March of 2024. And so we're expecting for that signature to happen. However, it's unclear if it's going to go into effect, only because civil rights organizations have already promised to file a lawsuit against this law. And being from Arizona, I recall exactly how SB 1070 played out, which when they passed its immigration law, there were lawsuits immediately filed, and the law didn't go into effect until 2 years after the law was signed, and it was a watered down version of its original intent. So, using history here, not to predict that this is exactly what's going to happen in Texas, but I can see something similar happening. Sign it into laws, lawsuits happening, going through the court system, eventually reaching the Supreme Court and bringing possibly a watered down version. However, I think the key difference here is that the Supreme Court makeup has drastically changed since 2012 when the Supreme Court ruled in the Arizona case. It's more conservative now, so it's hard to predict what's going to happen with this law in Texas. With that said, I think a story that I've been wanting to work on, and kind of like Camilo, is it's not necessarily a priority just because of how much immigration news is there. But one story that me and my editor had talked about is how the type of immigrants coming, particularly Venezuelans, how they've sort of shaped some of these Southwest cities. The type of Spanish, the type of food, the music, the type of businesses. I think when you think of the Southwest or Texas, we think of very Mexican culture as the predominant Hispanic culture. And I think with low Mexican immigration happening and with high Venezuelan migration happening, I think it's really going to change the nuances of how we view Hispanic culture in the Southwest, particularly in Texas, where many of them are staying here. And so that's a story that I really want to work on.
I'd love to read that. So you all have been working in this field for a little while now, and you talked a little bit about some of the things, but how has what it's like to work as an immigration reporter changed over the years that you've been working on this thing? From when you first started to where it is now, have you seen sort of just the work you do evolve and change? Maria, do you want to start this one?
Oh my goodness. No, I don't, but I will. I used to cover education in California in Orange County, which then it was in the middle of this huge demographic shift where there was it was in the 90s, and Mexican migration was at really high numbers, and changing places like Orange County, which was deep red at the time and now votes blue. Those kinds of transformations are what is making people argue, that Texas will flip. And because at the time, it really was unthinkable that a place like Orange County would vote so firmly Democrat. And so I got to watch all that happen in real time. And in the beginning of some of the dreamers who weren't called dreamers then, and the people I was reporting on in high schools, were graduating, into nothing. They didn't have any protections. Now they have so many protections in places like California. And now those folks would be in their 40s, which is really incredible. And there's been no legalization for them, no change. So that to me has been one of the most striking things. I mean, I know people are we've gotten so whipped up over potential deals over the past 3 decades, right? And every, with the parliamentarian, when after Biden took office, there was hope that there would be something passed. And really, what strikes me is not so much that what has changed, but what hasn't changed. That the United States has let people grow old who grew up here, and some have been able to fix it. Some have become citizens. Many have become citizens through marriage or other ways. Their children. I think that's what strikes me the most is how little things have fundamentally changed in spite of all the news of the day stuff. That Mexicans are by far the biggest number of DACA recipients. They're still the biggest number of undocumented immigrants, and they haven't been able to go home. Their parents have died. Anyone who's lost a parent knows how important it is to help care for them and hold their hand. And there are legions of people who lost that, who used to have it. And because of these tough laws, they don't anymore. And I think they are at risk of becoming forgotten, even though they're still such big numbers and have shaped the country in incredible ways. So that's a humanitarian aspect. I mean, a lot of people will say, that they broke the law, and that is in many cases true. A lot of people did break the law, and they broke the law in other ways, to work here and things like that. But in the criminal system, we have statutes of limitations that we don't have in the immigration system, and for a lot of people, being deported to places that might be way more dangerous than when they left is tougher than a criminal sentence. So that to me, that's one of the most striking things to me in this whole conversation.
Uriel, do you want to go next? What's changed in the time that you've been covering immigration?
I mean, obviously, I think there were some pretty drastic immigration policies going from Obama to Trump, right? But I think one underlying thing that I don't want to, and I think I'm dating myself here because I grew up in a generation that we're going up against not necessarily the false rhetoric that maybe policymakers may make, but social media. And I think immigration is one of those things that there's so much misinformation on social media. And so when I say that I'm trying to counter the narrative with facts, it's not necessarily politicians in DC. It's social media influencers or bad faith actors using social media to spread misinformation. And so I don't necessarily think that for me it has changed, but I think I do see the contrast when I talk, for example, with my editor who started covering immigration in the early 90s and how he covered it, right? Some of the stories are the same, but I think for when he tells me what the key difference now is just how polarizing the issue has become, right? Like it is just the language that is used to have a debate in immigration is really heavy. And for me, I don't want to say that it's normal, but it's definitely the way I've been conditioned as a reporter, that this is what I'm going up against when I'm trying to write stories that are based on nuance and facts and on the ground, is that we have social media influencers just portraying the debate just out of frame. And I think that's what gets to me a lot, because I can only write so fast. And in the time that I written and an article has been edited, there's hundreds of videos out there that people have viewed millions of times on the same topic.
Yeah. Camilo?
Yeah, I think something that I've learned that I value a lot now, based on my experiences since I started covering this, is that I now like fully embrace the belief that for many years, and I think to this day, the extremes on both sides of this issue have basically been the most vocal voices in this debate, and have in many ways led to a misrepresentation of what's going on, especially at the border, how the system works, and also have given people a false impression of where everyday Americans actually fall on this issue. Because if you talk to a lot of people on the ground, like I have, they agree on a lot of issues on immigration. It's not as polarizing on the ground for a lot of people who don't follow this closely. I mean, by and large, if you talk to a lot of folks on the ground, they support robust levels of legal immigration. They know this country has been fueled by immigration since its inception, right? They support an orderly process for people who have legitimate claims of protection. They don't support disorder and chaos. And they also want to make sure that the country is safe from a national security perspective, but also economically. And I think a lot of people fall into that middle ground. But if you only listen to the extremes on both sides of this debate, you would not think that. You would think otherwise. And if you listen to those extremes, you would either think that everyone coming to the US Mexico border is an asylum seeker who is fleeing imminent harm and who needs to be processed and allowed into the country indefinitely. Or you would think that they're all criminals, rapists, and national security threats who are invading the country, even though, again, there is absolutely no evidence that there's a military offensive being waged along the border, and that there's actually evidence that supports that most of these people are not serious criminals, but instead are people who, by and large, are migrants who are looking for better economic opportunities or safety, right? And so that's what I've learned a lot more throughout my time covering this, because when I started covering this, I think I, in some ways, relied on those voices to inform what I believed on this issue, and that has evolved by talking to people on the ground, by seeing it with my own eyes, by talking to people who disagree with each other. And so I would say that's the biggest thing that I've learned throughout my years covering immigration. And again, I have not covered immigration for a long time, relatively speaking, not as much as Maria, for example, or you, Theresa, who's been following this for a while. But in the time that I've had, that's something that I really value, that recognition that at the end of the day, the most vocal voices on this issue are not really reflective of what the everyday American and on the ground position is on many matters related to immigration. It's much more nuanced.
Well, I think we're going to leave it there. I want to thank Maria Sacchetti of the Washington Post, Uriel Garcia from the Texas Tribune, and Camilo Montoya-Galvez from CBS News for joining us today. If you don't follow these people and their reporting, please do. They are some of the best in the business. I learn from them every day. And, I will definitely look forward to whatever they choose to report on in the new year. So thank you to all three of you for joining us on This Week in Immigration. We really appreciate it.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. We'll be taking a holiday break and we'll be back with you in 2024 with new episodes. In the meantime, one last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. And you can follow me at Jack Malday. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malday. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BBC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you in the new year on This Week in Immigration.